Hi, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Mexican Excellence. My name is Citlalli, and today I'm going to talk about the conflicting term, concept, national identity of Mexican. Yes, this channel is called Mexican Excellence. Yes, generally I identify as Mexican because that's what people know, that's what people associate with. I understand. But today I wanted to talk about the conflicting process of what came to be known as Mexico. I'm going to keep it very brief. My goal is to make 10-minute educational videos. If you want to know more in-depth information, resources, research, thesis, interviews on these topics, I do teach a class called Decolonize. I have 12 classes available for free on this channel, and I will continue to teach it. So feel free to look at that for more in depth. This is meant to be a general summary on why I'm taking these positions, why I've researched these things, and why I've come to this conclusion. So yes, Mexican excellence, the contradiction, right? And there is a problem with the process of the concept of Mexican, as all nations that came after the imperial genocidal process that our ancestors went through. So really, really important. I'm going to talk about 3 books that will help you navigate this information and come up with these resources yourself if you want to read it on your own. But again, I do get into depth with these concepts and other of my classes on Decolonize. So make sure to check that out. Okay, so basically, the concept of Mexican, very, very general. What is a Mexican? What is not a Mexican? Mexican itself, the actual origins of the word Mexican come from Meshika. Meshika was what is erroneously called Aztec. It was the last ruling group of indigenous people that were governing the majority of the Valley of Mexico at the time of the European invasion on this part of our continent, which was about 1519. It took them a few years to get to actual Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Meshika, which was in 1521. So a little bit of more history about that. The Meshika, right, the group of the Meshika, they were the last of 7 groups to migrate down to the south. They're always in the origin stories, always point to the north, and as well as a bunch of other indigenous groups that settled in the Valley of Mexico. They all came and claimed to come from the north. So there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of theories on what specific location it came from. But as we know, we come from the north because that's where we established ourselves first as native peoples. Some of us stood and populated what is now known the US, Canada, and a lot of us went down all the way down to Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, and all that, the massive migrations, right? So this particular group of people, the indigenous people known as the Meshika, they were the last group to settle into the Valley of Mexico, and they called themselves the Meshika. Okay, the Meshika. The term Aztec did not come until late the century, but that was not a term that they used themselves, the indigenous people of Mexico Tenochtitlan. That was a term given to them as Olmec, right? Like the Olmeca, that was not a term that the Olmec themselves used. We don't know specifically what language they were using. This is thousands and thousands of years ago. But the actual term that we are referring to is Meshika. From Meshika, you get Mexican, you get Mexicano, you get Chicano, and hence the term Mexico for what we now know as Mexico. So remember, after 1519, after the Spanish invasion of the Valley of Mexico, what is now known as Valley of Mexico, they actually invaded the whole Western Hemisphere, right? Different groups of Europeans invaded different groups of our lands and established themselves, committed genocide, imposed their languages of religion, and based on their imperialistic greed and their imperialistic vision is how they started taking over the lands and started calling them certain areas. So our particular part of Mexico was called the Mexico, and it's surprising, right? Because it wasn't indigenous people running the game here, right? It was the Europeans, it was the Spaniards who were fighting for independence from Spain, very much like the US, right? They were fighting because they did not want to give tribute to the Spaniards from Spain. The Spaniards who were here in Mexico had to give tribute to the Spanish crown, right? And of course, they didn't want to do that. They wanted to keep all the riches and stolen wealth and stolen labor for themselves. So that became a conflict. So what they did is that they started an independence movement, and you learn all about this, but it's told in a very wrong lens, right? They started independence movement, which used Catholicism. They used a lot of indigenous folks of our people to fight these battles, right, under the pretense that they would be free. But in essence, it was not the liberation and independence for our people. When I say our people, I'm talking about indigenous people known as mixed blood or full blood, whatever that means, indigenous people. But it was basically the Europeans who had settled here, who had invaded here, who had had their kids here, and those are called the criollos. The Spaniards who were born here are the criollos, who were fighting to keep control of this land instead of having to pay tribute to the Spanish crown. And so when they created the independence movement, they called it Mexico, right? They called it Mexico as a way to establish a distinct identity, a distinct entity away from Spain. And they also stole the actual emblem of the Meshika, which was the eagle holding a serpent on its beak on top of a cactus. That's actually from a Meshika myth, as far as when they established Mexico Tenochtitlan. That comes from their mythology as far as what led them to establish and create their city. And that's a whole other video. But anyway, so what they did is that they chose indigenous symbols, indigenous concepts, right, to create this new nation to set them apart from Spain, because they do not want to pay tribute to Spain, right? So what do we have now is we have a government in Mexico that is still dominated by these criollos who have not left Mexico. You look at the cabinets and you might see a full like blood or an actual indigenous person in power. But as far as the legacy, as far as the consistency, as far as the government in Mexico, it is still European. It is still the descendants of the descendants of the descendants of that original elite power racial oligarchy that was in control of Mexico. And it's really, really important for you to know that, because we have this illusion that, oh no, Mexico is a new race, it's a mestizaje. That's all a myth to reinforce white supremacy. It's a myth to reinforce this idea that Mexicans were created by the Spaniards, that we didn't exist unless the Spaniards invaded us and then created us and all that, which is a bunch of BS, because we were already many nations. What is now known as Mexico was many nations. This whole concept of one umbrella term to come take over an entire populations, entire, ethnic groups and different groups of people, that's a very capitalistic view of viewing human populations. And it's really important to view that and understand that, because when you look at imperialism and white supremacy in this process of genocide, you're looking at the creation of nationalism. So once they killed 95% of our population, those of us that survived were put into missions, and I'm talking about specifically in Mexico, and this definitely happened all over our hemisphere, but specifically in Mexico, those of us that survived that initial physical genocide, we were put into missions. We were forbidden to speak our languages. We were given, in the majority, European names, and we were forced to take on the Spanish religion. It wasn't by choice. It wasn't this miraculous thing that many movies claim. It was a very violent, and think about it, you have the Inquisitions going on, right, in Europe, and you think about the Spanish Inquisition and all these things. Well, those same tactics that they use against each other in Europe and against the Muslims in Europe, they used against our people. So it wasn't the whole pretty little picture of conversion and we saw the light and we became Christians. It's nothing like that. It was a very violent, very systemic genocidal process that came to this, what we have today, Mexico. We have today a very Catholic, a very mestizo-minded, a very white supremacist, culturally based nation that reinforces these concepts, because these concepts come with that legacy of white supremacy, and they were birthed through that process of the killing of our people in the majority, and then imposing this national identity. And this national identity was supposed to completely erase indigenous people. It was supposed to make us all mestizo, which mestizo is a white supremacist concept. I urge you to please look that up. I've been saying that for 2 decades already. Research is there. And really important, I want you to look at this book. I don't think it's been translated to English yet, but it's called México Racista, una denuncia by Federico Navarrete. He is a Mexican anthropologist, historian, social critic, amazing book, and he calls attention to this. And the most important aspect of his research that completely blew my mind is that he said that when Mexico was created and this whole concept of Mexicanism as an identity, it was done to completely erase indigenous identities, indigenous languages, and make it seem as if indigenous people were gone. And it's now this whole new Mexican identity, this Mexican culture, right? But that was done to suppress the uprisings of indigenous folks all over Mexico. It was done to suppress the fact that the majority of people, like he said, the majority of people in Mexico and in the 1700s, 1800s, majority were Nahuatl speaking Mexicans, right? So the fact that they called them all mestizo and they called them all this, it was a way to demographically, kill off that very strong indigenous population that was the majority of Mexico. So what he says is that it's not that that so many indigenous people were killed and that all of a sudden we're all mestizo now. He said that the language that was used to define indigenous and being Mexican was taken over, and this whole cultural identity of Spanish was now used to impose this mestizaje mentality that completely undermines and ignores the indigenous presence of Mexico. I know that's a lot to cover. So check out my class where I talk about that. It's called Decolonize. I have a playlist on here, so check it out. I dedicate a whole hour and a half to this topic. Look up Federico Navarrete. He gets into this. So he said it was a linguistic genocide that happened in Mexico, where they made it seem that everyone was speaking Spanish, everyone was mixed blood, but he counters it. He says it is impossible that so many indigenous people mixed with Europeans. He calls that a white supremacist farce. It did not happen. Most social classes at this time of this, which is 1800s, were not intermixing. That was completely looked down upon. So it is statistically impossible that such a mergence of cultures happened. So I really, really encourage you to check out this book, México Racista, una denuncia. Now, before I end this video, I do want to make you aware of 2 other books that are really important. It's this one, Colonizer's Model of the World. This kind of gives you, J.M. Blau, a German, it kind of gives you a panoramic view of white supremacy, of how nationalism portrays itself and how race is used in capitalism and imperialism. So check it out. Really, really important to understand the whole logic and the psychology of white supremacy and how it's embedded in this whole power scheme of resources, of land, of demographics. Really important. So that's J.M. Blau, Colonizer's Model of the World. And lastly, this gets me to the whole concept, right? So I gave you a very brief history of where the term Mexican comes from. And as problematic as it is, you see my channel, I'm called Mexican Excellence. Why? Because I know that the majority of my people, that's the audience that I'm trying to target, they know Mexican. They don't know indigenous. They don't know Kumeyaay. They don't know Mixtec. They don't know all these other indigenous groups of people that we are, right? Because that has been systematically denied to us. So what we know is Mexican. That is why I purposely, knowingly use Mexican, because I want to be relevant. I want my people to know what I'm talking about and what audience I am targeting, which is why I use Mexican Excellence. Now, lastly, the book I recommend is called Race and Classification, The Case of Mexican Amerikkka. This is really important. As you can tell, if you look at my channel, look at the videos that I have, I do not call myself Hispanic or Latino. Hispanic or Latino are marketing schemes to completely exploit the demographics of our population, which, if you don't know, Mexicans, Central Americans, those of us who are indigenous, we are actually the majority that make up the so-called pie, the whole graph of Hispanic or Latino. And by using the term Hispanic or Latino, they're trying to make it seem that we're all the same, we all buy the same shit, and it's all BS. And this book gets into it. They get into saying why it's a marketing scheme, how it was created. And it's really, really important that we understand that. It's really, really important that we see that it has been used as a way to exploit our demographics, because in case you don't know, we are the majority, are gonna be the majority in this so-called United States. And it's really important that we see. So for example, on page 193, it says, I'm gonna read you a very small excerpt, and with that, I'm gonna end this video. And it says, Latino identity has been in the invention of Cuban American advertising executives in South Florida and New York, who in the 1970s and 1980s were eager to lump and homogenize small Latin American national group identities into a larger unitary market sector. If they could create a clearly identifiable Latino market, they'd stood a profit enormously. They could then persuade large food, beverage, and domestic product manufacturers that Latinos constituted a significant mass market that needed special advertising campaigns only these agents were expertly prepared to address. So as you can see, marketing schemes, capitalism, it's not about Latino heritage, it's not about, oh, we speak Spanish, it's nothing like that. It's a market. We're being used, we're being exploited for our numbers, for our demographics, for our culture. And like Snow the Product says, they want our culture, but they like our culture, but they don't like us. So with that, this was a quick history lesson on why the term Mexican, the concept Mexican is problematic, where it originated from, why I'm using it, and why we should be very, very aware of how white supremacy has used nationalism to exploit our populations. So check it out, Race and Classification, Colonizers Model the World. And lastly, this is in Spanish language, México Racista, una denuncia, Federico Navarrete. So check out more videos on my channel. This is Citlalli from Mexican Excellence. I have 12 classes that I taught on these topics. So check it out. It's called E-Decolonize. I have a playlist on there, and stay tuned for my monthly E-Decolonize courses coming to you very soon. Don't forget to subscribe, like, check out. I have a Facebook page as well. And here we are. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stay beautiful. Brown is beautiful.